Good morning, buenas. This is Mike Gawel, and I'd like to say I'm really honored to be invited to the first session of the Marianas Terrestrial Conservation Conference of 2021. I'm really looking forward to the entire conference, which is going to present a lot of good scientific information on latest research on conservation and management practices. On the other hand, my talk is a little bit different, where I'm going to give you some of my observations over the last 50 years as I've worked in the Marianas on various conservation matters. I'll talk about these topics: traditional conservation, federal influences on conservation, local conservation actions, then international and regional partners, and then at the end give some observations on 3 of the laws that apply to conservation here. For traditional conservation, I think we all know that for thousands of years, the Chamorros and Carolinians here in the islands have harvested and subsisted and consumed the native species, the fruit dove, the seeds of the cycad, the green sea turtle, the coconut crab, and the fruit bat. And those were still being eaten and evidently available 50 years ago when I arrived here. And that indicates that there was a conservation result of managing the use of these resources over those thousands of years. 50 years ago, the population in Guam was 84,000. Now it's more than doubled. At that time, there were conservation programs and areas of protection that I'll mention later. And 1/3 of the land was under military control. For the Northern Mariana Islands, at that time, they were part of the United Nations Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, the TTPI. These are all the islands that were held by Japan before World War II. And after the war, they, under the UN, were administered by the US Department of the Interior. And they had some conservation programs in areas there too. They include 6 districts of Micronesia, and the Marianas District was one of them, which is now the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. At that time, there were 13,000 population, and now it's estimated at maybe 54,000. The Trust Territory map covers all the Micronesian areas shown here, and you can see the Northern Marianas was the district north of Guam. For letting you know where my experiences and knowledge lie, so that you can come up with questions and discussions later, I'm going to run through some of my experiences over the last 50 years. I was a wildlife ecology student at Yale School of Environment when I moved to the Pacific Islands in 1969, where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer at the University of the South Pacific in Fiji, which was a new university. We developed curriculum and did research and teaching. Then in 1973, I moved to the University of Guam to do a master's degree at the Marine Lab, actually. And my first job in Guam was doing ecological baseline surveys for the Corps of Engineers. My first semester was spent in the Ganya Swamp, where I was able to observe all the native species of birds and other ecological features and write them up, and even observe the brown tree snakes. But at that time, we didn't have a clue that the snakes were impacting the bird populations. Then in 1974, I started work at the new Guam EPA, and that was created in 73. And so it was brand new. We were setting up programs there when I worked there. Then I moved on to the Bureau of Planning, where the Guam Coastal Management Program was being developed. And I worked on the pre-program to get it approved for federal funding for future years. In 77, I moved to the TTPI based in Saipan as an environmental planner and serving all of the Micronesian TTPI region. Then in 1980, I spent a little time at the East-West Center studying planning, and back to Fiji and Kiribati with the USP for a short time. And then finally moved to a job as the first chief of marine resources at the Federated States of Micronesia, based in Pohnpei. Thinking I'm going to be returning to Guam shortly after that. But 10 years later, I finally came back to Guam and worked on the Itinota land use plan for Guam and zoning, and also served for a while as the administrator of Coastal Zone Management Program in Guam and as the chief planner at Guam EPA. And then finally, for the last 10 years of my service, I was with the U.S. National Park Service for Guam and Northern Marianas, managing natural resources of the parks. That's what I looked like arriving in Guam in 73 and how I am now still being active, although I'm retired. Talk about some of the laws and regulations that I've worked with that deal with conservation, include things like the Army permitting system, which certainly protects wetland habitats. The Lacey Act also is an important act that controls movement of endangered species and their products. Migratory Bird Treaty Act is important here too. The Sykes Act was another one of the ones that were in place, at least in Guam, and even in the TTPI before 1970. The Sykes Act requires the Department of Defense to provide integrated natural resource management plans, which is important to our islands, I think. The 1969 the passing of the National Environmental Policy Act was an amazing breakthrough that set up the program to review proposed developments, looking at alternatives, getting public input, and creating mitigation needs for development of projects. I also work with the Clean Water Act and other EPA related acts. And the Endangered Species Act of 1973 was obviously really critical and will, be a basis of a lot of the work that we're presenting at our conservation conference this week. Finally, I'll mention the CERCLA, or Superfund Act of 1980, because it was in the news last month where the government of Guam succeeded in having unanimous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court saying that the Navy has a liability responsibility in the cleanup of the Ordat dump on Guam, which involves the wetlands and other natural resources too. The federal programs here, Coastal Zone Management Act, of course, I'm prejudiced because I worked on it, developing it, but each state has its own coastal zone plan. And the one developed for the Northern Marianas created a permitting system, charging fees for permits and controlling developments, which was really necessary in those days for the CNMI. Guam didn't have such a permit system, but provides funding through its program for a lot of the partners doing conservation activities. Fish and Wildlife Service is active here too. Manages the National Wildlife Refuge at Meridian and participates in the Marianas Trench Marine National Monument Management, which was created in 2009 by my old college classmate, George W. The national parks where I worked on Saipan and in Guam were created in 1978, and they serve for conservation purposes. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has a lot of programs. I'm not mentioning them all, but things like Forest Service and Natural Resource Conservation Service that help with our conservation work. And finally, the Department of Defense conservation actions include things like the ecological reserve areas of Haputo and Orodi Peninsula on Guam and other mitigations. And they restrict base restrictions, that is, and entry to some of the habitats on base. They support brown tree snake control projects too, and have the on-base restrictions like no taking of coconut crabs and no off-roading. This is a particular point of contention with me, that with 5,000 Marines planning to be based on Guam, hundreds of them will be off-roaders, but they won't be off-roading on base. The local laws that have been important and I've worked with include the endangered species list for CNMI and for Guam. Also the preserves and conservation areas, many of were established before the 1970s, like in Guam, the Bolanos and Kotal, Anao and Ipiga areas. And there are other controls that I've worked with, like zoning and building permits that manage and protect native vegetation that's proposed to be cleared. There are hunting regulations applied in our islands, and there's the Guam Seashore Protection Act that I'll mention later. In the CNMI, the Constitution and the Covenant with the U.S. Provides for conservation areas of some of the uninhabited islands, including Uracas, Ascension, Maug, and Guguan. And Suriguen also has a form of conservation applied to it. The customs and quarantine regulations help, especially in controlling movement of endangered species and also invasive species. For international partners, I mentioned the SPC, which has expertise in agriculture and forestry and land use and fisheries and other resources, and SPREP, the Regional Environmental Program, which deals with endangered species and pollution control. Both of these service 21 members of independent Pacific Island countries and territories. Also mentioned the Migratory Bird Treaty, which applies to some of the countries where the birds migrating through our islands need protection. CITES is an international convention that controls import or export of endangered species. Ramsar is another international convention that applies to us and deals with wetlands. And finally, I mentioned the Micronesia Challenge, which is a really successful and active and critical movement that leads the world in a sense in protecting conservation areas and dedicating land and sea areas for conservation. I don't have time to mention the many NGOs that also can play a part in our conservation, although I'm a bit disappointed in lack of activities over the last 50 years of NGOs for conservation on Guam. Finally, three different acts I'll mention. Some of you already know this, but the Mariana's first endangered bird listed was the nightingale reed warbler. And this was listed before we understood that brown tree snakes were affecting the bird populations. It was listed because its habitats were being developed. The marshes that it needed were being filled in by developments, and that was the reason why it needed protection. Another Endangered Species Act move of 1973 declared that green sea turtles would be listed and made the special allowance in the US law for traditional consumption by Micronesians. So in most cases, US laws don't take into account the special needs of the islands, but this was an exception. And finally, I'll mention the Guam Seashore Protection Act of 1974, which establishes the Guam Seashore Reserve. The law requires a plan be made, and it ensures the control and ownership and access for the public of all beach and shoreline areas of Guam. But it needs a plan to be developed. And this is being done this year by the Guam Bureau of Statistics and Plans, which welcomes public input at this time. Contact for public input would be Chelsea Willis, as shown here. And unfortunately, they're having a public input meeting from 9 till 11 this morning, which I believe we'll miss at the governor's main conference room. And finally, I'd like to thank you all for your respect for the old man and listening to my talk. Hopefully you'll come up with questions, and if you don't get them in today, you can always reach me at this email address. And in closing, I'm showing a picture of one of the many secretaries of the Interior that I've worked under. This one in particular probably influenced my leaving the Department of the Interior. Thank you.